The ceiling fan in the living room spun with a lazy, rhythmic tick that usually acted as a metronome for Aurelia's afternoon naps. Today, the sound felt more like a countdown. She sat on the edge of her sofa, a cold glass of tea sweating in her hand, her eyes locked on the television. The Florida sun was streaming through blinds and bright, dusty bars, painting a picture of suburban normalcy that the news broadcast was systematically dismantling. The news anchor, a man named Marcus who had been a staple of evening television for a decade, looked different. His tie was loosened, and the professional sheen of his forehead had been replaced by a thin film of cold sweat. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at a monitor off-screen, his mouth slightly agape. "We are just receiving this footage from our affiliate in Central Georgia," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "I want to warn viewers that what you are about to see is graphic, though not in the way we are used to. This is a structural failure on a scale we haven't seen since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Yet there is no recorded seismic activity on any USGS sensors." The screen cut to a wide-angle shot of a highway interchange outside of Atlanta. It was a clear day. Traffic was moving steadily. Then, without a single tremor, a 300-foot section of the overpass simply vanished. It didn't crumble or fall in chunks. It looked as though the earth had turned into a vacuum, pulling the concrete, the steel girders, and 20 vehicles into a perfectly circular void. There was no dust cloud, no explosion, just a sudden, clean absence. Aurelia set her tea on the coffee table. She noticed the liquid in the glass didn't ripple, but it shivered. A fine, high-frequency vibration was passing through the air, so faint she almost thought it was her own pulse. She reached out and touched the surface of the wooden table. It was humming, not like an appliance, but like a hive of bees hidden somewhere deep within the grain. She stood up and walked to a window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek out. Her neighborhood in Tierra Verde looked untouched. Across the street, the miller's golden retriever was sitting on the sidewalk, but it wasn't barking. It was staring at the ground, its head tilted, whining with a low, mournful sound that carried through the glass. The dog knew. Animals always felt the subsonic frequencies before the human-built world figured out how to measure them. She turned back to the TV. They had brought on a specialist, a woman in a lab coat who looked like she hadn't slept in 48 hours. "It's not a sinkhole," the scientist explained, her voice trembling as she pointed to a map of the southeast dotted with red markers. "A sinkhole is a localized collapse of limestone. What we are seeing here is more like instantaneous liquefaction of the crust, but it's being triggered by something specific. We've noticed a pattern. The collapses are occurring in areas with high mechanical resonance, near factories, busy highways, or rail lines. The vibrations from our own infrastructure seem to be the catalyst. The ground is becoming excited by our movement, and then it simply gives up." The screen flickered, the image breaking into digital blocks. Marcus reappeared, looking even more frantic. He was holding a piece of paper that had clearly just been handed to him. "We have a report from the Department of Transportation," Marcus said. "They are issuing a total silence order for the following counties. If you are in these areas, do not start your vehicles. Do not use heavy machinery. If you're inside a concrete structure, evacuate to soft ground immediately. The weight and vibration of human activity are accelerating the television went black. The silence that followed was heavy and oily. Aurelia stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for the secondary shock. It didn't come as a shake. Instead, the low-frequency hum began to rise through the soles of her boots. Aurelia's breath hitched. She looked at her phone on the counter. It was silent. No bars. The grid was starting to fail as the anomalies moved south. She knew the geography of Florida. The state was a honeycomb of limestone caves. If the crust was liquefying in Georgia, Florida was a ticking time bomb. She didn't panic, but she moved with a sudden, sharp purpose. She went to her closet and hauled out her expedition-grade hiking pack. It was a massive, internal frame monster designed for weeks on the trail. She began to strip of anything non-essential, replacing clothes with vacuum-sealed pouches of cat food, a hand-crank radio, and her heavy-duty monocrystalline solar array. Every movement she made was deliberate. She didn't slide the drawers. She lifted them. She didn't stomp. She placed her feet with the precision of a tightrope walker. She could feel the house responding to her weight. The floorboards groaned in a way they never had before, a sound under immense, unnatural pressure. She moved to the kitchen and gathered her 3 cats. Mainsail, the heavy ginger tabby, was the first. He was hiding behind the refrigerator, his fur standing on end. She clipped him into his harness and leashed him to the top loop of the pack. Keel and Knot, the sleeker black and calico pair, were next. They were huddled together in the pantry. She harnessed them and hitched their leads to the side compression straps of the pack. She practiced the weight. With the pack on her back, Mainsail sat perched on the very top, his weight centered over her shoulders. Keel and Knot were draped like living scarves over the side pockets, their leashes short enough to keep them from jumping, but long enough for them to adjust their balance. They were off the ground. That was the only thing that mattered. If the ground was hunting vibration, their tiny, rhythmic paw prints wouldn't be the thing that gave them away, but she wasn't taking any chances. As she was tightening the waist strap, the first true tremor hit her house. It wasn't a shake. It was a massive, bone-deep jolt that felt like a freight train had slammed into the side of the building. The sound wasn't a rumble. It was a sharp, agonizing scream of the house's foundation being sheared in half. The hutch in the dining room didn't just rattle. It tipped, sending 3 generations of ceramic plates onto the hardwood in a chaotic explosion of shards. Aurelia grabbed the edge of the counter, her fingernails digging into the granite as the floor beneath her boots groaned with mechanical metallic stress. Then came the silence, a heavy, suffocating quiet that felt like the world was holding its breath. "Easy, boys," she whispered. Mainsail hissed, his claws digging into the top of the rucksack. She checked the window again. Mr. Henderson was no longer standing on his lawn. Where his bird bath had been, there was now a 6-foot-wide hole that smelled of ancient, damp earth and sulfur. The ground was no longer solid. It was starting to breathe, the grass undulating in slow, sickly waves. Aurelia didn't wait. She knew the news reports were right. Movement was the enemy. She stepped toward the back door, her movements fluid and slow, placing the balls of her feet down first to minimize the impact. She bypassed the front porch entirely. She knew the concrete was a conductor for the vibrations that were currently tearing through the neighborhood. Instead, she climbed out the side window, dropping onto the soft mulch of her flower bed. The air outside was thick and smelled of rotted vegetation. To her left, the neighborhood was waking up to the nightmare. She saw a young mother trying to push a stroller down the sidewalk. The wheels clattered against the pavement, a sharp, rhythmic sound. "Get on the grass." Aurelia tried to shout, but her voice was drowned out by a sudden, wet, tearing noise. The sidewalk beneath the stroller didn't just crack. It vanished. The woman screamed as the front wheels of the stroller dipped into a widening fissure. Aurelia watched, paralyzed, as the ground swallowed the concrete path like it was made of quicksand. The woman managed to haul the baby out just as the stroller was sucked into the dark, but the panic in her eyes was a death sentence. She started to run toward her house. "No, don't run," Aurelia hissed, but the woman didn't hear her. With every heavy footfall the woman made, the ground reacted. Tiny geysers of gray silt began to spray up from the lawn, the soil liquefying in real time under the pressure of her frantic escape. The porch of the woman's house exploded upward, the concrete slab buckling like a sheet of paper. Aurelia forced herself to turn away. She couldn't save them. The more noise she made, the more likely she was to join them. She began her trek toward the marina. She avoided the roads, sticking to the sandy soil of the coastal yards. The weight of the pack was immense, and the cats were shifting constantly, their claws occasionally pricking through her shirt as they struggled to maintain their balance on the moving pack. She reached a local park, a space that should have been a sanctuary but was now a landscape of horror. The massive oak trees, some over 100 years old, were leaning at impossible angles. Their roots were snapping with sounds like gunshots as the liquefying soil refused to hold them. She saw a squirrel frozen on a low branch, its entire body vibrating in sympathy with the earth. Aurelia navigated through a stand of pine trees, using the deep taproots as stable islands. Every few steps, she had to stop and let the cats readjust. Mainsail was growling, a low, guttural sound that vibrated against the back of her neck. Almost there, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. As she moved past the community center, she saw a group of people gathered around a running car. They were trying to pile suitcases into the trunk, the engine idling with a steady mechanical thrum. Turn it off. She wanted to scream, but she stayed in the shadows of the trees. The ground didn't wait for them to finish packing. A circular depression began to form directly under the car. It happened slowly at first, the tires sinking into the asphalt, and then all at once, the car, the people, and the suitcases were gone, leaving only a hole that echoed with the sound of rushing water from a broken main. Aurelia felt the ground beneath her own feet soften. She didn't run. She dropped to her knees, spreading her weight across as much surface area as possible. She felt the pulse of the earth, a rhythmic, heavy beat that felt less like a geological event and more like something huge moving far below. She waited until the pulse faded. Her legs were trembling, the physical strain of the 60-pound pack and the mental tax of the constant threat wearing her down. She pushed herself up and continued, her boots making almost no sound on the pine needles. She finally reached the commercial district near the water. The scene was a graveyard of abandoned dreams. High-end boutiques had their windows shattered not by looters, but by the warping of their frames. The smell of leaking gasoline from a nearby station was thick in the salt air. She saw the marina gates ahead. The water in the bay was gone. The tide had receded nearly half a mile, exposing the muddy, debris-strewn bottom. Boats sat at impossible angles in the muck, their keels snapped or buried. But at the very end of the deep-water pier, the one anchored into bedrock, sat the EV Fresh Air. The ship was a masterpiece of silent utility. Its sleek, white hull rose high out of the water, and its flat upper decks were tilted slightly toward the afternoon sun, showcasing rows of deep black monocrystalline solar panels. They were motionless, soaking up the light that would power her escape. The pier was a nightmare. The heavy wooden pilings were swaying like stalks of wheat in a storm. Aurelia didn't walk. She moved in a low, fast crouch, her weight centered. Halfway down the dock, a section of the wood snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The section of the pier she was on dropped 3 feet, jarring her teeth. Mainsail let out a terrified yowl, his claws sinking deep into her shoulder. Aurelia gasped but didn't stop. She scrambled up the slanted wood, the weight of the cats nearly pulling her backward into the churned-up mud of the harbor. She reached the gangway of the ship. The metal ramp was vibrating, humming like a tuning fork. She scrambled up, her boots clattering on the aluminum, and dove through the main hatch. She slammed the heavy door shut and engaged the seals. The silence of the interior was immediate and deafening. She dropped to her knees, the hiking pack hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She unclipped the cats, her hands shaking so hard she could barely work the carabiners. Mainsail, Keel, and Knot scrambled out, immediately heading for the center of the cabin where the floor was most stable. They began to groom themselves frantically, a nervous reaction to the trauma of the journey. Aurelia didn't waste time. She moved to the bridge. The control panel was dark, but with a flick of a switch, the systems hummed to life. The display showed the battery levels, 100%. The monocrystalline array had done its job, drinking in the Florida sun while the world around it fell apart. She engaged the electric thrusters. There was no roar of an engine, no vibration that would travel down the pilings and into the hungry earth. Just a faint, high-pitched whine. She eased the throttles forward. The ship jerked free of the crumbling pier, the severed lines falling into the water. Aurelia watched through the reinforced glass. The entire marina was beginning to fold. The palm trees were sliding into the bay, their fronds waving a final, frantic goodbye. The land was retreating, sinking into the dark, and for the first time in hours, the ship beneath her remained perfectly, blissfully still. She turned the helm toward the open sea, heading for the deep, silent blue of the Atlantic. Ahead of her lay 3 months of silence, powered by the sun and protected by the water. She was out. For now, she was safe. The transition from the violent, grinding sound of the shore to the rhythmic lapping of the Atlantic was so abrupt it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from Aurelia's chest. The EV fresh air moved with a ghost-like grace, its twin electric pods pushing it further from collapsing Florida coastline. Behind her, the sunset was a bruised purple and orange, but the silhouette of the land was wrong. It was too low, the jagged edges of the skyline interrupted by plumes of dust where high rises had finally succumbed to the liquefaction. She didn't engage the autopilot yet. She kept her hands on the helm, feeling the subtle resistance of the water. On land, vibration was a predator. Out here, it was merely a ripple in a vast, deep medium. The ship's hull was a sandwich of carbon fiber and closed cell foam, designed specifically to dampen sound. It was the quietest vessel ever built, and tonight, silence was the only currency that mattered. Aurelia looked at the cats. Mainsail had claimed the captain's chair the moment she stepped away. His orange were glowing in the amber light of the instrument panel. Keel and Knot were prowling the perimeter of the bridge, sniffing the air vents. They were still tense, their tails twitching at every creak of the hull. But the frantic, wide-eyed terror they had shown on the hiking pack was beginning to fade. She reached over and adjusted the master display. The monocrystalline solar panels on the deck were no longer generating power now that the sun had dipped below the horizon, but the battery banks were nearly full. At a steady 5 knots, she could run for days without needing a single ray of light. She needed to check the long-range radio. During her escape, the local channels had been a mess of screaming and static, but out here, she might be able to pick up the Coast Guard or the international seismic monitoring stations. She toggled the frequency to the emergency band. Static, a wall of white noise filled the bridge. She adjusted the squelch, her fingers moving delicately over the dials. This is station, anyone. The signal was faint, buried under layers of atmospheric interference. The shelf is retreating. We are seeing a total displacement of the coastal. Do not approach the continental shelf. Stay in deep water. The voice cut out, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulsing sound that made Aurelia's blood run cold. It wasn't static. It was the same subterranean beat she had felt through the soles of her boots in the kitchen. But here, it was being picked up by the radio's antenna. The frequency was so powerful, it was bleeding into the electromagnetic spectrum. She turned the volume down until it was a whisper. She couldn't listen to it. Not yet. She left the bridge and headed down into the main cabin to secure the cat's area. She had spent months preparing the interior of the EV fresh air for a long-term stay. The floor was covered in thick, industrial rubber matting to prevent any accidental thuds or clatter. Every cabinet had magnetic latches that required a firm pull to open, ensuring that if the ship rolled in a storm, nothing would shatter. She opened a locker and pulled out 3 bowls, placing them in a custom-built wooden rack that bolted to the floor. "Dinner," she said softly. The sound of her own voice felt alien in the silence of the ship. The cats reacted instantly. The familiar ritual of mealtime grounded them. She popped the top on a can of high-protein salmon, the smell filling the cabin. Mainsail was the first down the ladder, followed by the others. For a few minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of their tongues against the ceramic bowls. Aurelia leaned against the galley counter, watching them. Her legs finally gave way, and she slid down to the floor, her back against the cool metal of the refrigerator. The adrenaline that carried her through the 2-mile trek to the marina was evaporating, leaving a hollow, shaking exhaustion in its wake. She looked at her hands. They were stained with gray silt from the playground, a fine, powdery dust that felt like dry bone. She rubbed her palms together, watching the dust fall onto black rubber matting. That silt was the physical remains of Florida she'd grown up in, the crushed limestone and ancient seashells that had held the state together for millions of years. A sudden, sharp thud against the hull made her jump. It wasn't the rhythmic beat of the Tremors. It was something solid. She scrambled back to the bridge and grabbed a high-powered searchlight, though she hesitated before turning it on. Light could be just as much a beacon as sound. She settled for the infrared night vision binoculars instead. She scanned the water around the ship. About 20 yards off the starboard bow, a large piece of debris was bobbing in the swells. It was a section of a wooden dock, likely ripped from the marina she had just fled. Tangled in the pilings was a white life ring and a cluster of shredded palm fronds. She watched as the debris drifted past, but as she followed it with the binoculars, she saw something else. A ripple, not a wave caused by the wind, but a deliberate, powerful displacement of water. Something large was moving just beneath the surface, heading back toward the shore. It moved with a serpentine grace, leaving a wake that glowed with a faint, ghostly bioluminescence. Aurelia held her breath. The thing was at least 40 feet long. It didn't look like a whale or a shark. It looked like a living muscle, a thick, gray core of energy that pulsed in time with the radio static she had heard earlier. She watched it until it vanished into the dark toward the crumbling coastline. The vibration hunters. That's what the rumors had called them. But the rumors hadn't mentioned they could swim. Or perhaps they weren't swimming. Perhaps they were just moving through the liquid mud that the bay had become. She returned to the helm and increased the speed to 8 knots. She needed to get past the continental shelf. The deeper the water, the safer she would be. The predators, if that's what they were, seemed tied to the land, to the vibrations of the crust. The deep ocean floor was basalt, much denser and harder than the porous limestone of the coast. She navigated by the stars in her GPS, which was luckily still pinging from the satellites overhead. The coast of Florida was now nothing more than a faint line of darkness on the horizon, devoid of the sprawling neon lights that usually defined it. The power was gone. The people were either silent or swallowed. As the night deepened, Aurelia began the process of settling into her new reality. She set a proximity alarm on the radar. Anything within a half-mile would trigger a silent, vibrating alert on a bracelet she wore. She checked the water desalinator, a high-efficiency unit that ran off the solar batteries. It hummed quietly, a comforting sound of life-sustaining technology. She went back to the galley and made herself a cup of coffee using a small, insulated French press. She didn't use the electric kettle. The whistle was too loud. She used a small butane stove, watching the blue flame with a sense of reverence. It was the only light in the cabin besides the dim red glow of the instrument panels. She sat at the small dinette table, not jumping up to sit in her lap. The calico cat was purring, a deep, vibrating rumble that Aurelia found herself trying to synchronize her breathing with. 3 months, she told Knot, stroking the cat's soft ears. That's what the early report said. The stabilization period. She wasn't sure she believed it. How could the Earth stabilize after this? The entire shelf was falling apart, but the EV Fresh Air was built for 6 months of autonomy. She had the food, she had the water, and she had the sun. She finished her coffee and headed to the small sleeping berth in the bow. She didn't undress. She lay on top of the sleeping bag, her boots still on, her hand resting on the hiking pack she had dropped by the door. The ship swayed gently in the deep water swells. It was a different kind of movement than the land. It was predictable. It was fluid, just as she was drifting off to sleep. The radar alarm on her wrist pulsed. One sharp, short vibration. Aurelia's eyes snapped open. She didn't move. She waited for the second pulse. There, buzz. Something was within a half-mile of the ship, and it wasn't a piece of debris. The radar showed a consistent, moving target. It was circling. She rolled off the bed and crawled toward the bridge, staying low to the deck. She didn't turn on the lights. She reached for the binoculars again, her heart hammering against her ribs. The moon had risen, casting a cold, silver light over the water. At first, she saw nothing but the white caps. Then she saw it. A small, inflatable boat was drifting about 400 yards out. It was a black Zodiac, the kind used by the military or search and rescue. There was no motor running, but she could see the silhouette of a person sitting in the center. They were holding a paddle, but they weren't rowing. They were just sitting there. Aurelia watched them for 10 minutes. The person didn't wave. They didn't shout. They just stared in the direction of the EV Fresh Air. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. In a world where sound was deaf, a silent stranger in the middle of the ocean was more terrifying than a monster. She reached for the ship's internal intercom, then stopped herself. Any sound could carry over the water. She watched as the stranger slowly raised a hand, not in a wave, but as a signal. A second later, another black silhouette emerged from the water behind the Zodiac. It was the same serpentine shape she had seen earlier. It rose out of waves, its gray, segmented body glistening in the moonlight. It didn't attack the boat. It coiled around it almost protectively. The stranger on the boat looked toward Aurelia's ship and held a single finger to their lips in a universal gesture for silence. Then the Zodiac and the creature beneath it dived. They didn't sink. They dived with purpose, vanishing into the black depths of the Atlantic in a single, smooth motion. Aurelia sank to the floor of the bridge, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wasn't alone out here, and the predators weren't just hunting. They were being guided. She stayed on the floor until the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, turning the monocrystalline panels into glowing rectangles of blue-black glass. The second day of the end of the world had begun. The Atlantic was a vast, indifferent mirror under the midday sun, but the silence on the bridge of the EV Fresh Air was starting to feel heavy. Aurelia had been at sea for only 4 days, but the reality of her supplies was beginning to gnaw at her. In her haste to escape the initial liquefaction of Tierra Verde, she had prioritized getting the cats and herself onto the boat above all else. She had enough to last a few weeks if she was careful, but with 3 cats and herself, the margins were razor thin. If she was going to survive the predicted 90-day stabilization period, she needed a buffer. Every time she opened a can of tuna for the cats, she felt a small pinch of anxiety. The ocean was supposed to be her pantry. But without the right gear, she was just a passenger on a drifting life raft. She spent an hour in the galley, counting every pouch of cat food and every gallon of water. The math never lied, and the math said she was in trouble. She spent the morning staring at the chart plotter. The GPS was still functional. showing her position about 15 miles off a stretch of the Florida coast that remained a state park. It was a remote area with a small coastal town that housed a high-end marine supply shop and a local grocer. If any place still had dry land and canned goods, it was there. She watched the screen for hours, checking for any signs of abnormal sea level shifts before she made her move. She looked at the shoreline through her binoculars, noting the way the palms leaned at unnatural angles. The town looked abandoned, a bleached skeleton of a tourist trap. The white sand of the beaches had turned a sickly, muddy gray, and the water near the shore was churning with debris. She could see the remains of a lifeguard stand floating a mile out, a lonely splinter of wood in the vast blue. Aurelia headed to the stern where the tender was housed. The EV Fresh Air was equipped with a high-end aluminum-hulled RIB, suspended by a hydraulic davit system. She had modified the davit months ago, wiring a waterproof, wireless keypad to the underside of the lifting hook. This allowed her to position the tender under the crane from the water and trigger the hoist while standing in the smaller boat. It was a fail-safe that meant she wouldn't be stranded at the waterline. She checked the battery levels on the tender's electric outboard, seeing a full charge. The silence of the electric motor was her greatest weapon. She couldn't afford to announce her arrival to whatever was left on land. She checked her radio, her compass, and her knife. She felt like a soldier prepping for a raid, a feeling that sat uncomfortably in her stomach. She checked her hiking pack, making sure it was empty and ready for a heavy load. She wasn't taking the cats this time. She filled their bowls to the brim, gave Mainsail a final scratch behind the ears, and sealed the bridge door. The cats watched her through the glass, their tails twitching in a rhythmic, nervous cadence. They knew the difference between the boat's steady hum and the tension of a departure. They huddled together on the helm chair, watching her until she disappeared below the gunwale. The descent into the water was silent. The electric motor of the tender hummed with a low frequency as she began a long, slow approach toward the shore. The water near the coast was a sickening shade of brown, choked with the silt and runoff of the collapsing interior. She reached a small patch of pavement that had buckled upward near the old town pier, creating a makeshift ramp, and secured the tender to a bent signpost. The air on land was thick and humid, smelling of stagnant water and something metallic that made the back of her throat itch. It was the smell of the deep earth being coughed up into the sun. The town was a graveyard of suburban dreams. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional groan of a building settling into the softened earth. She moved quickly to the marine supply store first. The front windows had been blown out by a pressure surge, leaving a carpet of glass that crunched under her boots. She moved into the shadows of the store, the air smelling of salt and expensive fiberglass. The store was a wreck, with racks of colorful life vests scattered like fallen leaves. She found exactly what she needed in the back corner: 2 heavy-duty, multi-piece offshore travel rods and a professional saltwater tackle box. These were high-carbon rods built to withstand the pull of a heavy ocean fish. She took her time inspecting the eyes of the rods, ensuring they weren't cracked. She found a spool of 80-pound test line and shoved it into her pack. She secured the rod cases to her hiking pack using the side compression straps and moved toward the grocery store across the street. The street itself was a maze of fissures. She hopped over a crack that breathed out a cold, damp draft from the subterranean caverns below. Every movement had to be calculated. If she tripped and made a loud enough sound, the vibrations would travel through the cooling crust of the earth like a dinner bell. She reached the grocery store, the sliding glass doors jammed halfway open. Inside the market, the air was cool and smelled of rot from the produce section. The linoleum floor was slick with a thin layer of gray silt that recorded every one of her footprints. She moved with agonizing slowness, placing each foot carefully to avoid making the floorboards creak. The grocery store was a maze of overturned displays and shattered jars of pickles. She managed to fill her pack with canned vegetables, rice, and jars of peanut butter, her eyes constantly scanning the dark corners for any sign of movement. She felt the weight of the pack increasing, the straps digging into her shoulders. Every can she added felt like a victory, but also a liability. She found a shelf of pet food that hadn't been picked over and grabbed several bags of high-end kibble, stuffing them into the crevices of her pack. She moved toward the back of the store, hoping to find more protein, when she saw a display of dried jerky. Just as she was reaching for a final bag of beef jerky on the top shelf, a low, subsonic vibration rattled the metal shelving. The cans on the floor began to dance, creating a frantic metallic chatter. Aurelia froze, her hand trembling. From the back of the store, near the loading dock, a wet, sliding noise echoed through the aisles. It sounded like a massive muscle being dragged over sandpaper. A hunter had sensed a shift in the building's weight. She didn't wait to see it. She bolted for the front exit, her heavy pack swaying and threatening to pull her off balance. Behind her, a massive, segmented limb smashed through a drywall partition near the pharmacy, showering the aisle in a cloud of white dust. She could hear the thing behind her, the ground itself seeming to groan as it moved through the foundations of the store. She burst out into the street, her lungs burning from the exertion and the dust. The sunlight was blinding after the dim interior of the market. As she scanned for a path back to the tender, she heard a sharp, pained whimper. A golden retriever was huddled under a rusted SUV parked at the curb. The dog was limping, its front paw held at an awkward angle, trapped as a ripple in the asphalt headed straight for its hiding spot. The ground around the SUV was beginning to liquefy, the tires sinking into the blacktop like it was quicksand. The dog's eyes were wide with terror, its tail tucked tightly between its legs. Aurelia didn't hesitate. She reached into her pocket and threw a heavy can of soup at a nearby metal dumpster to create a diversion. As the predator veered toward the metallic clang, the ground bulging as it moved, she dove under the SUV. The dog licked her face, a frantic, desperate gesture of gratitude. She scooped up the trembling dog, ignoring the sharp pain in her own back from the weight of the pack. She scrambled toward the center of the road where the concrete seemed more stable, her boots slipping on the slick surface. The hunters moved on, drawn by the sounds of collapsing grocery store. Behind her, the roof of the market finally gave way, pancaking into the aisles with a roar that masked her escape. She stood in the middle of the silent street, clutching the dog to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She waited for the sound of the earth to settle, her ears ringing from the adrenaline and the sudden silence. The dog was heavy, its heartbeat thumping against her ribs like a frantic drum. She could feel the dog's warmth through her shirt, a stark contrast to the cold, dead town around her. She looked down at the animal, its golden fur matted with gray silt. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of a nearby pharmacy. Aurelia spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached for the knife at her belt, her knuckles white. A man stood there, watching her with predatory stillness. He was wearing a dark, tactical jacket and carried a massive military rucksack that looked like it weighed 100 pounds. A short, suppressed rifle was slung across his chest, the barrel pointed safely at the ground but ready to rise in a heartbeat. He didn't look scared. He looked like he was evaluating a tactical situation. His face was smeared with dark grease, and his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He stood in a way that suggested he was ready to move in any direction at once. "Keep moving," he said, his voice a low, gravelly command that cut through her panic. "They'll be back for the dog. They can track the heartbeat if you stay still too long. They sense the rhythm through the soil." Aurelia stared at his precise movements, the way he scanned the street with a focus that felt entirely different from her own panic scouting. "Who are you?" "Kalen," he said. "Navy SEAL. Or I was," before the world turned to soup. He didn't wait for her to respond. He stepped into the street and reached out, taking the heavy weight of her hiking pack and slinging it over his own shoulder as if it were filled with feathers. He looked at the dog in her arms and then back at her, his expression unreadable. "You have a boat?" "The tender's at the signpost by the pier," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "Then let's go," Kalen said, his eyes scanning the buckled asphalt with the intensity of a man who had survived a dozen wars. "I'm not planning on dying in this town, and neither are you. Walk where I walk. Don't stop for anything." They moved toward the water together, the former frogman leading the way with a silent, measured gait that ignored the chaos of the shifting earth. They stayed to the center of the road where the pavement was thickest, avoiding the muddy gutters and the soft shoulders of the lawns. Kalen moved with fluidity that suggested he could feel the ground's intent before it shifted. He stepped over cracks and fissures without looking down, his rifle always scanning the periphery. As they reached the tender, Kalen scanned the tree leaning the rooftops one last time before stepping into the small boat. He unslung his massive rucksack, placing it carefully in the center to distribute the weight, and signaled for Aurelia to take the controls. He sat in the bow, his rifle held low but ready, his eyes never leaving the shore as they pulled away from the buckled pier. The dog sat at Aurelia's feet, its head resting on her boot. The ride back to the EV fresh air was tense. The extra weight of Kalen, his tactical gear, and the injured dog made the tender sit noticeably lower in the water. Aurelia kept her eyes on the depth sounder, navigating the silt-choked shallows until they reached the clear blue of the open Atlantic. The transition from the murky, brown coastal water to the deep sapphire of the sea felt like a physical weight lifting off her chest. "How long have you been out here?" Aurelia asked, her voice carrying over the soft whine of the electric motor. 6 days since my unit was disbanded," Kalen said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "The base at Mayport is gone. Sunk. I've been moving down the coast, looking for something that wasn't pinned to the land. You're the first thing I've seen that looks like it might stay afloat." When they finally arrived at the ship, Kalen looked up at the white hull. He gave a sharp, appreciative nod. It was a professional evaluation, the look of a man who recognized a solid tactical advantage in a world without fuel. He looked at the layout of the deck, noting the storage lockers and the height of the gunnels. He helped Aurelia secure the tender to the davit. Once the boat was hoisted and they stepped onto the deck, the silence of the ocean felt safer than it had in days. Kalen set his pack down by the bridge door, his presence immediately filling the space. He didn't ask for permission to board. He simply began checking the tie-downs and the perimeter of the deck, his training taking over. He examined the winches and the cleats, testing their strength with a firm tug. Aurelia carried the dog inside, the cats watching from the top of the galley cabinets with wide, suspicious eyes. Mainsail hissed, a low, vibrating sound that made the dog hide its head under Aurelia's arm. She set the retriever down on a soft rug and turned to see Kalen standing in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the fading light of the horizon. "You got a good rig here," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying that edge of authority. "We need to put at least 20 miles between us and that coast." The vibrations from the collapse travel through the shelf further than you'd think. "We need deep water where the ground can't reach us." Aurelia nodded, moving toward the helm. She realized her life had just changed again. She wasn't just surviving alone anymore. She was sharing her sanctuary with a stranger who knew exactly how to fight the things in the mud. She reached for the throttles, the hum of the electric motors a comfort in the growing dark. "What about the rucksack?" she asked, gesturing to the massive pack on the deck. "Everything I need to keep this boat yours," Kalen replied. He sat in the co-pilot's chair, his rifle resting across his knees as he stared out into the vast, dark emptiness of the Atlantic. Aurelia engaged the drive, and the EV fresh air began its journey away from the dying continent. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, blood-red light over the water. Inside the cabin, the dog let out a long sigh and closed its eyes. The cats, sensing the change in the atmosphere, slowly descended from their perches and began to sniff at Kalen's boots. He didn't move, but his hand reached down to rest on Mainsail's head. The cat didn't hiss. The ship cut through the waves, a tiny spark of life in an increasingly hostile world. Aurelia looked at the man beside her, wondering what other secrets were hidden in that massive rucksack and what it really meant to have a Navy SEAL on her bridge. For now, it meant she wasn't alone, and that was enough to keep her hand steady on the wheel as they headed into the deep. The interior of the ship was bathed in the soft, amber glow of the cabin lights as it pushed further into the black expanse of the Atlantic. The vibration of the electric motors hummed through the deck plates. The transition from the chaotic, crumbling shore to the steady rhythm of the hull cutting through the swells was a relief that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Aurelia knelt on the galley floor, her hand steady but her heart still racing from the adrenaline of the escape. Beside her, the golden retriever lay on its side, its chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid pants. The dog's fur was matted with the gray, silt mud of the town, and the smell of stagnant water and old earth clung to its coat. Kalen didn't hover. He moved with a quiet, practiced economy. He knelt on the other side of the dog, opening a small, olive-drab medical roll from his pack. He didn't ask for permission to take the lead, but he didn't bark orders either. He simply held out a hand for the clean water Aurelia had already prepped. He began by gently dabbing away the dried blood and grit from the dog's leg. Every time the dog flinched, Kalen's hands remained perfectly still, waiting for the animal to settle before continuing. He worked with surgical focus, his brow furrowed as he inspected the damage. The paw is crushed, not severed, Kalen noted, his voice low so as not to spook the animal. He used a pair of surgical shears to trim the matted, silk-covered fur away from the wound. We need to irrigate this and get a compression wrap on it. If we don't get the grit out now, the infection will take the leg by morning. Aurelia handed him the saline wash, watching as he worked with level precision that made her realize just how much of a lifeline he was. She held the dog's head, whispering into its ears as Kalen cleaned the grit from the deep lacerations. The dog flinched, a low whine escaping its throat, but it didn't struggle. It seemed to understand that the two humans in a small, warm room were its only hope. The sound of the saline splashing into a plastic basin was the only noise in the galley for a long time. "I've got some topical antibiotics in here," Kalen said, reaching into a specific pocket of his kit. "It's military grade. It'll keep the infection at bay until we see how the bone knits. We'll need to change this dressing every 12 hours. They worked in a silent, synchronized rhythm, passing gauze and tape back and forth. There was no struggle for dominance, no questioning of who owned the ship or who led the mission. There was only the work. Once the paw was bandaged in a neat, white wrap, Kalen gave the dog a final pat on the flank and stood up, his joints popping. He checked the dog's temperature by feeling its ears and nodded to himself. "He'll live," Kalen said. "He just needs to stay off that leg for a week." Aurelia stood too, wiping her hands on a towel. "Thank you. I wouldn't have known where to start with that. I have medical supplies, but nothing like what you just used." Kalen nodded toward the bridge. "We have work to do, but first, there's something you should see." He walked over to his massive rucksack, which was leaning against the galley table like a slumped soldier. He unzipped a padded side compartment and pulled out a rugged, waterproof case. Inside was a thick black tablet with a reinforced screen and a heavy-duty rubber housing. When he turned it on, the light reflected in his eyes, and for the first time, Aurelia saw a flash of genuine, boyish excitement on his face. "I've got over 5,000 books on here," he said, scrolling through the library. "Everything from primitive forge building to deep-sea mariculture and emergency surgery. I've been curating this for years, long before the shelf started to give. I was terrified the battery was going to give out before I found a way to charge it. My portable panels were smashed during the initial liquefaction in the city. He looked at the power outlets near the galley counter, then at the ship's control panel. If your system can handle the draw, this tablet is our library. It's every bit of knowledge we're going to need once the internet officially goes dark for good. It has maps, structural engineering guides, and botany manuals. Aurelia smiled, a genuine one that reached her tired eyes. The battery bank is massive. Between the turbine and the monocrystalline panels, I can charge that thing 10 times over and not even see a dent in the reserves. Plug it in. It's the best news I've heard in months. While the tablet began to pull power from the ship's grid, they moved to the deck. The night was cool, and the smell of the open sea was finally starting to wash away the metallic scent of the dying land. Keel pulled the multi-piece travel rods they had salvaged from his pack. He didn't just assemble them. He checked the tension of every guide and the seating of every reel with a meticulous touch. He explained the benefits of the high-carbon construction as he threaded the 80-pound test line through the eyes. From his own gear, he produced a set of heavy, shimmering lures designed for deep water trolling. These are weighted for the current we're in, he explained, showing her the intricate way he tied the knots. We're over the shelf now. If we can land a tuna or a mahi, we can stop dipping into your canned reserves. The cats need the fresh protein as much as we do. They set the rods and holders along the gunnel, the line screaming out as the lures hit the water. They stood there for an hour, watching the phosphorescence in the wake. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a silence of two people who had found a common purpose. Suddenly, the center rod doubled over, the drag wailing a high-pitched protest. "Fish on!" Keel shouted, but he didn't grab the rod. He stepped back, giving Aurelia the room. "Your boat, your first catch. I'll get the gaff and the landing mat." Aurelia gripped the rod, feeling the raw, powerful surge of massive animal fighting for its life. Her muscles burned as she pumped the rod, gaining back inches of line at a time. The fish ran deep, then doubled back, trying to get under the hull. Keel stood ready, his eyes locked in the dark water, offering quiet encouragement but letting her do the work. When the silver flash of a large yellowfin tuna finally broke the surface, he moved with the speed of a striking snake, gaffing the fish and swinging it over the side in one fluid motion. The tuna thrashed on the deck, its scales shimmering like chrome in the moonlight. Aurelia leaned against a rail, gasping for breath, a surge of triumph washing over her. "That's 40 pounds of fresh protein," Keel said, already reaching for his knife to bleed the fish properly to preserve the meat. "We're not just surviving anymore, Aurelia. We're starting to live." After the fish was processed into clean fillets and stored in the freezer, they moved to the helm. The chart plotter showed the coastline creeping by, a jagged line of uncertainty. Keel pointed to a spot on the map, where the water deepened into a dark, royal blue. "There," he said, "the DeSoto Canyon. The water drops off to over 3,000 feet. The vibrations from the mainland won't be able to travel through the soft sediment of the deep trench. We find a city near there, make our runs, and then we disappear into the blue where the ground can't follow." They spent the next day navigating the ship toward a larger city. It was a sprawling coastal metropolis that had been built on a bed of solid limestone, making it more stable than the sandy town they had left behind. The skyscrapers stood like broken teeth against the horizon, but the industrial district near the harbor seemed relatively intact. Through the binoculars, Aurelia saw a massive, warehouse-style supply depot sitting near the water's edge. "That's the target," she said. "If we can hit that, we can stock the ship for a year. It's far enough from the residential zones that we might not have much competition." They took the tender in. The electric motor silent. The city was a ghost of its former self, with the sound of the wind whistling through empty windows. The warehouse was intact, though the loading docks were partially submerged. Inside, the sheer scale of the supplies was staggering. They found an industrial, heavy-duty flatbed cart near the loading dock, its wheels still greased and functional, working together. They began to pile it high with sacks of flour, 5-gallon buckets of rice, and sealed crates of dried beans. Kalen stayed near the entrance, his rifle held in a low-ready position, his eyes scanning the cavernous aisle for any sign of movement. He watched the shadows with a hunter's patience while Aurelia worked the cart, her movements frantic but efficient. They moved a mountain of food to the water's edge, the cart's heavy wheels groaning under the weight of nearly 1,000 pounds of supplies. "We have to load this perfectly," Kalen whispered as they reached the tender. "If the weight shifts in the silt or the wake, we're going down. We need the center of gravity as low as possible." They spent 2 hours balancing the load, stacking the heavy dry goods in the center of the RIB. They used cargo nets Kalen had in his pack to lash the buckets down, so they wouldn't slide during the transit. When they finally pulled away, the tender was sitting so low that the water was only inches from the gunwale. They moved with agonizing slowness, Aurelia navigating the debris and the floating trash until they reached the ship and offloaded the massive hull using the davit crane. The electric winch groaned under the strain, but the aluminum hull of the tender held firm. "We're going back," Aurelia said as the last crate was winched onto the deck. "I saw a nursery about 3 blocks from the warehouse. I'm not living off rice and beans forever, and the cats need greens to keep their digestion right." The second run was different. The nursery was a sprawling complex of glass houses that had somehow survived the initial tremors. Aurelia moved through the aisles like a woman possessed, gathering saplings of dwarf citrus, bins of heirloom seeds, and heavy bags of nutrient-rich organic soil. She found vegetable starts that were still clinging to life in their plastic trays: kale, tomatoes, and peppers, their leaves slightly wilted but still green. She carefully placed them into crates, making sure the roots weren't disturbed. Kalen helped her haul the heavy bags of soil, his strength allowing them to take twice as much as she could have handled alone. They loaded the tender with the green life, the bright leaves of the trees, a jarring contrast to the gray, dusty city surrounding them. He even found a few specialized gardening tools and a bag of natural fertilizer to add to the pile. He kept a sharp eye on the surrounding rooftops, but the city remained eerily silent, the only sound being the distant groan of steel. By the time they returned to the ship for the second time, the sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows over the deck. The ship was a controlled chaos of crates and saplings. They didn't rest. They spent the night working under the deck lights, Kalen using his tools to secure the heavy food crates in the hold, while Aurelia began the process of setting up the garden beds and the large, built-in planters along the stern. She mixed the soil and carefully transplanted the citrus trees, securing them with twine so they wouldn't tip in heavy seas. She felt the damp earth between her fingers, a stark reminder of what they were trying to preserve. As the ship finally turned its bow toward the deep water of the canyon, the deck looked like a floating forest. The pantry was overflowing. The cats were prowling through the new greenery, and the dog was sleeping soundly near the helm, its bandaged paw tucked in. The cabin felt smaller with all the new supplies, but it also felt more like a home. Aurelia looked at Kalen, who was standing at the rail, his silhouette dark against the starlight. They had done it. They were a team, a functioning unit in a world that had forgotten how to cooperate. They had food, knowledge, and a way to grow more. "Get some sleep?" Kalen said, his voice echoing softly over the water. "I've got the first watch. We're in deep water now. The ground can't touch us here." The interior of the ship had transformed from a clean, sparse vessel into a dense, green sanctuary. The atrium, once just an open space for light and air, now breathed with the scent of damp earth and citrus leaves. Aurelia worked with focused intensity, her fingers stained dark from the organic soil they had hauled from the nursery. She moved between the 6 dwarf citrus trees, 2 lemon, 2 lime, and 2 orange, carefully positioning their heavy, anchored planters so they would catch the maximum amount of sunlight through the reinforced glass overhead. Beside them, the 4 olive saplings stood like silver-green sentinels, their roots now firmly packed into the nutrient-rich ground. She took her time with each one, ensuring the drainage holes weren't blocked by the heavy silt and that the soil was packed tight enough to prevent the roots from shifting during a heavy swell. Kalen knelt nearby, his attention on the technical side of the garden survival. He didn't just pour water into the pots. He was building a system designed for the long haul. He had unrolled a length of thin, flexible tubing from his pack, connecting it to a small, specialized desalination drip he had rigged from his own survival gear. It was a clever piece of engineering that utilized the heat from the ship's internal systems to pull fresh moisture from a small auxiliary tank, bypassing the need to drain their primary drinking water reserves. He moved with a steady hand, securing the tubing along the base of the 24 vegetable starts. The kale, peppers, and tomatoes were already beginning to perk up, their wilted leaves reaching toward the natural light. He spent nearly an hour just calibrating the pressure, making sure the flow rate was a steady, rhythmic pulse that wouldn't drown the delicate root systems of the pepper plants. The sound of the drip feed was a mechanical heartbeat in the quiet room. Kalen adjusted a small valve, ensuring that each plant received exactly what it needed to survive the salt-heavy air of the Atlantic. He didn't look up when Aurelia moved to the edge of the atrium, watching him work. He was thorough, checking every seal and every anchor point to make sure that a sudden roll of the ship wouldn't send 100 pounds of wet earth sliding across the deck. He even went as far as to label each tube with a small piece of waterproof tape, noting the specific moisture requirements for the citrus versus the olives. Once the garden was stabilized, they moved to the bridge. The morning sun was bright, reflecting off the calm water as they drifted over the deep blue silence of the trench. Kalen pulled his tablet from his protective casing and set it on the chart table. The screen glowed with detailed, high-resolution schematics that Aurelia had never seen before. He began to scroll through a library of technical manuals, his fingers stopping on a section dedicated to deep-sea anchoring and current riding. He explained how the bathymetry of the DeSoto Canyon created unique thermal layers and how they could use those layers to their advantage. "We can't just drop a standard hook here," Kalen said, his voice low and instructional. "The DeSoto Canyon is too deep for a traditional chain. If we want to stay stationary without burning the motors, we have to use the currents. There are subsurface countercurrents that run opposite to the surface drift. If we deploy a sea anchor at the right depth, we can effectively park the ship in one spot using nothing but the physics of the water. It's like kiting, but in reverse and under the surface." He showed her the math on the screen, the data points calculating the drag, and the battery drawer required to maintain their heading. It was a level of preparation that made the ship feel less like a boat and more like a fortress. They spent an hour cross-referencing the ship's GPS with the tidal charts on the tablet, mapping out a series of waypoints that would keep them positioned directly over the deepest part of the trench. They discussed the dead zones where the acoustic signature of the ship would be muffled by the sheer depth of the silt below, a vital piece of information for remaining undetected. With the technical briefing complete, they prepped the RIB for the next run. The water was glass calm as they approached a massive, all-in-one retail center that sat on a raised concrete plateau near the harbor. It was a sprawling, windowless monolith that had escaped the worst of the flooding, though the parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles half swallowed by the encroaching tide. They pulled the small boat into a loading bay that was partially submerged, the black rubber of the hull bumping gently against the concrete as they tied off to a rusted iron bollard. Inside, the store was cathedral consumerism, silent and shadowed. The air was stale, smelling of old plastic and damp cardboard. They didn't waste time in the electronics or toy aisles. They moved directly to the clothing department, targeting the high-quality outdoor gear. Aurelia began pulling moisture-wicking base layers, heavy wool socks, and thermal underwear from the racks. She looked for durability over style, selecting rugged, waterproof shells and insulated parkas that could withstand the freezing spray of a winter storm at sea. She made sure to grab multiple sizes, anticipating the wear and tear of long-term use. Kalen focused on the footwear, finding several pairs of high-end tactical boots with reinforced soles and waterproof membranes. He tested the weight of each pair, choosing ones that would provide traction on a wet, moving deck. He also scavenged for heavy-duty work gloves and reinforced belts, knowing that their current gear would eventually fail under the strain of constant maritime labor. They spent extra time in the hunting section, grabbing scent-blocking camouflage and thermal line hats, items that would serve them well during cold nights on watch. In the sporting goods section, they hit a gold mine of high-end fishing supplies. They gathered braided lines with hundreds of pounds of test-strength, heavy-duty saltwater reels, and boxes of specialized lures designed for the monsters that lived in the canyon. They found carbon fiber rods that were light enough to handle, but strong enough to pull 100-pound tuna from the depths. This wasn't for sport. It was their primary food source for the foreseeable future. Near the back of the section, Aurelia found what she had been searching for: a professional-grade vacuum sealer and dozens of boxes of heavy-duty, industrial-sized bags. "We need this more than almost anything else," she said, tossing a box into their cart. "If we can't keep the air out, the salt will eat everything we've gathered." They loaded the RIB until it sat low in the water, the weight of the clothes and gear pressing the tubes deep into the swell. But they weren't finished. They moved the small boat a few hundred yards down the quay to a specialized restaurant supply depot. This building was different. Built of heavy steel and reinforced concrete, it was designed to hold massive amount of weight and withstand the harsh industrial environment of the docks. The interior was cold, the thick insulation of the walls keeping the heat of the sun at bay. They moved past the shattered glass of the front office and into the warehouse. Here, the supplies were in bulk. They found 50-pound bags of sea salt, gallon jugs of olive oil, and massive containers of peppercorns and dried herbs. Kalen used a manual pallet jack to move a high-capacity deep freezer toward the loading dock. It was a chest-style unit, built with thick walls and a heavy-duty compressor that would easily integrate into the ship's existing power grid. They found 5-gallon buckets of honey, the kind that never spoils, and crates of high-calorie nutritional bars intended for emergency shelters. The work was grueling. They hauled crates of vacuum-sealed coconut oil, staples that would provide the high-calorie density they needed to stay sharp. Every item was a brick in the wall they were building between themselves and the chaos of the world. They spent nearly 2 hours just staging the gear on the dock, organizing it so that the heaviest items would sit directly over the rib's keel to prevent it from capsizing during the transit back to the ship. Back at the ship, the work of integration began. They didn't just toss things into the hold. Kalen spent the afternoon inside the lower compartments, using his tools to build custom bracing for the new deep freezer. He drilled into the reinforced ribs of the hull, securing the unit with heavy steel bolts and nylon webbing. He accounted for the pitch and roll of the vessel, ensuring the lid wouldn't fly open in a storm. He worked with meticulous rhythm, his movements practiced and efficient, showing a level of carpentry skill that matched his medical and tactical knowledge. Aurelia took charge of the interior storage lockers. She moved with methodical pace, organizing the bulk dry goods so the weight was distributed evenly across the keel. She used bungee cords and cargo netting to lash down the crates of oil and the sacks of grain. She knew the sea was a fickle neighbor. Anything not tied down would become a projectile the moment the weather turned. She cleared out old, non-essential items to make room for the new haul, ensuring that the most frequently used items were the most accessible. She spent time labeling every locker, creating a master inventory list so they wouldn't have a hunt for supplies in an emergency. The sound of the vacuum sealer became the new soundtrack of the evening. They set up a workstation on the galley counter, the machine whirring and hissing as it sucked the air out of bags. They repackaged everything: the new clothes, the bulk spices, the bags of rice, and even the emergency medical supplies. Each bag was a shimmering, airtight brick, impervious to the moisture and corrosive salt air that lived in every corner of the ship. They spent hours sitting side by side, the repetition of the task creating a strange, quiet intimacy. They worked through stacks of wool socks and thermal shirts, sealing them in compressed bundles that took up half the space they once did. They even took the time to vacuum seal a few of the physical books Kalen had found, preserving the paper against the humidity. They discussed the layout of the ship's library on the tablet, Kalen showing her how to navigate the complex folder system he had created. They looked at maps of the surrounding ocean floor, identifying potential areas for deep-sea fishing and hidden coves where they could tuck away if the weather turned truly violent. As the last of the sun's light bled out of the sky, they finally stepped out onto the deck. The ship felt different now. It was no longer just a vessel. It was a fully functioning, self-sustaining homestead. The garden in the atrium was silent, the trees anchored and fed. The hold was full, the gear was secured, and the power grid was holding steady, the monocrystalline panels having soaked up every bit of the day's energy. Aurelia checked the charge levels on the bridge, 98%. It was a perfect number. They sat on the stern, the dog resting its head on Kalen's boot, the cats prowling through the new forest of citrus trees. The water around them was a deep velvet black, the only light coming from a faint, distant glow of the stars and the soft, red hum of the bridge instruments. They didn't look back at the coast with longing. They looked at the inventory list on the tablet, checking off the items they had secured. They discussed the next steps of the garden, planning how they would rotate the crops to ensure a steady supply of greens. "We have enough here to stay out for months," Aurelia said, her voice barely a whisper in the wind. She felt the weight of the supply runs in her muscles, a good kind of exhaustion that came from building something real. Kalen nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark water met the darker sky. "We have what we need to wait. The ground is still shifting back there, but out here, we're on our own terms. We have the food, the power, and the knowledge. We aren't just drifting, we're positioned." They spent another hour on the deck, talking about the technical aspects of the ship's turbine and how they might improve the water filtration system even further. They felt the shift from desperate flight to a prepared, mobile homestead. The ship was no longer a temporary escape pod. It was their world. They checked the lines of the RIB one last time, ensuring it was pulled tight against the davits, and then retreated inside, leaving the silent, dark Atlantic to carry them through the night. The cabin felt warm, filled with the scent of the new garden and the promise of morning where they didn't have to run. The transition into the second month at sea brought a psychological shift that neither Kalen nor Aurelia had anticipated. The initial adrenaline that fueled their escape and the frantic fortification of the ship had finally ebbed, leaving behind a vast, hollow quiet. The ship, once a vehicle of flight, had become their entire universe, a floating island of steel and silicon in a world that had otherwise gone dark. Every morning, Aurelia woke to the subtle, rhythmic creak of the hull and the low-frequency hum of the electric motors, a sound that had become the heartbeat of her existence. It was a constant reminder that they were alive, but also that they were alone. She spent the first few hours of day 46 in the atrium. It was a glass-enclosed sanctuary where the air felt heavy and alive, smelling of damp earth and growing things, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of the lower decks or the stinging salt spray of the exterior. The garden was no longer just a collection of hopeful seeds in plastic trays. It was a thriving, verdant engine of survival. The spinach and butter lettuce had filled out, their broad, emerald leaves overlapping to create a dense carpet of green that seemed to drink in the artificial light. The pepper plants were taller now, their stems thickening into sturdy stalks, and tiny white buds have begun to crown the tops, promising a future harvest of heat and flavor. Aurelia knelt on the rubberized flooring, a pair of pruning shears in her hand. She moved with a slow, meditative focus, clipping away yellowing lower leaves to ensure the plant's energy went into new growth. She found herself talking to them in the silence, a soft murmur that grounded her when the horizon felt too wide and empty. She wasn't just growing food. She was tending to the only living things on the ship that didn't require a technical manual to understand. In a world of cold metal and complex circuitry, the simple, honest requirement of soil and water was a mercy. She found herself obsessing over the pH levels of the water and the exact height of the LED arrays, knowing that these plants represented their only source of vitamins once the canned goods eventually dwindled. While Aurelia managed a life in the atrium, Kalen was buried in the ship's guts. He had become increasingly fixated on the mechanical longevity of their home. He spent hours in the engine room, not because anything was broken, but because he was terrified of the moment it might be. One afternoon, he called her down to the technical hub, where the large monitors displayed the ship's power consumption and mechanical health in a series of glowing blue graphs. "We're at a crossroads," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile space. "The monocrystalline panels are doing their job. We're pulling in more power than we can store on sunny days, which is exactly why I chose them. But the mechanical parts are wearing down under the constant load. These electric motors are incredible, but they aren't magic. They are connected to the propellers via reduction gearboxes. Those gears are under thousands of pounds of torque every time we move, even when we're just station keeping over the trench." He pulled up a maintenance log on the screen, pointing to a line of red text. "The synthetic gear oil has a shelf life, and more importantly, a breakdown point. The heat from the friction eventually shears the molecules apart. And the seals on the propeller shafts? They're starting to show signs of drying out from the salt exposure. If we don't get specialized lubricants and replacement parts now, we'll be dead in the water by month 4. I don't want to be floating helpless when the winter storms start rolling in. We can't afford to be a drifting target." The decision was made to make one final, targeted industrial scavenge. They weren't looking for grocery stores this time. Those would be death traps, picked clean or guarded by the desperate. Instead, they were looking for the specialized chemicals and components that kept a high-tech vessel from becoming a floating tomb. They spent 3 days planning the route, identifying a commercial shipyard on a remote stretch of the coast that specialized in deep-sea trawlers and industrial tugs. It was a gamble, but a necessary one. The approach to the pier on day 50 was a study in tension. Kalen kept the ship nearly a mile out, tucked behind a rocky outcrop to break their silhouette against the horizon. They took the RIB in, the small boat skipping over the waves with a muted growl. The industrial zone was a skeleton of rusted cranes and hollowed-out warehouses, a graveyard of the global economy. The silence here was different from the silence of the sea. It was heavy with the weight of things abandoned in a hurry. Aurelia felt a cold shiver as they tied off the RIB to a barnacle-encrusted piling. The ground felt wrong under her feet, too solid, too still. It didn't have the life of the ship. They moved through the warehouse with practiced efficiency. Kalen took point with the rifle, his eyes scanning the rafters and the dark corners of the offices for any sign of movement. Aurelia headed for the maintenance department, her boots echoing on the concrete. She found the blood for the ship in the back of a climate-controlled locker that had luckily remained sealed. There were 5-gallon pails of high-grade synthetic gear oil, tubes of thick, waterproof marine grease for the drive seals, and a wooden crate containing the holy grail of their mission, for brand-new vacuum-sealed membranes for the desalination system. These were the high-pressure filters that stripped the salt from the seawater. Without them, the ocean was a desert. As she hauled the crates toward the loading dock, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every scrape of plastic on concrete sounded like a siren. She looked back and saw Kalen standing by a window, staring out at the empty town beyond the shipyard. For a moment, he looked incredibly small against the backdrop of a dead civilization. The world was rotting, and they were trying to grease the gears of a ghost. "We have what we need," she whispered as she reached him, her voice cracking the stillness. "Let's get home," he replied, his voice tight. He didn't call the ship a vessel anymore. It was the only home they had left. The return journey to their deep water parking spot over the canyon was marked by a brutal heat wave. For 3 days, the sun hung in a cloudless, white-hot sky that seemed to bleach the color out of the ocean. The temperature on the deck soared, and the humidity made the interior of the ship feel like a sauna. This was the ultimate test for their power systems and their own endurance. Kalen spent the peak hours of the day in the battery room, monitoring the thermal load on the lithium-ion banks. The monocrystalline panels were performing at peak efficiency, but the sheer amount of energy being pushed into the system was generating its own heat. He showed Aurelia how to manually shunt power, diverting the excess into the water maker to run at full capacity, filling their reserve tanks to the brim, while simultaneously cranking the climate control to keep the atrium from boiling the plants. "Balance, Aurelia," he said, his face slick with sweat. "In this world, everything is a trade-off. You trade power for water. You trade silence for security. If you push the batteries too hard, they swell and fail. If you don't push them hard enough, the garden dies. You have to be the governor of this entire system." They spent the evenings of the second month in a state of constant training. Kalen was a demanding teacher, driven by a hidden fear that he might not always be there to lead. He had her dismantle and reassemble the desalination pump until her fingers moved by instinct. He taught her how to read the ghosts on the sonar, how to tell the difference between a school of tuna, a thermal layer in the water, and a hard metallic hull. By day 60, the change in Aurelia was profound. The soft, nervous woman who had stepped onto the ship 2 months ago was gone. Her hands were calloused. Her skin was tanned a deep golden brown from her brief moments on deck, and she moved with physical confidence she had never known. She was no longer a passenger. She was an operator. To celebrate their 60-day milestone, Aurelia harvested the first real yield from the garden. They sat at the small galley table, the lights dimmed to save energy, eating a salad of crisp spinach and butter, lettuce dressed in a simple vinaigrette. It was the best thing they had tasted since the world ended, a crunch of life in a world of preserved mush. "We made it 60 days, Kalen said, lifting a glass of filtered water. "Most people didn't make it 7. I wonder how many are left," Aurelia said softly, looking out the porthole at the black expanse of the night sea. She thought of the smoke plumes she had seen on the coast and the silence of the radio bands. "Maybe it's better we don't know," he replied. "Knowledge can be a burden we aren't ready to carry yet." The peace of the 60-day mark was short-lived. On the 63rd day, the morning started with a low-priority alarm on the bridge, a soft, persistent chiming that signaled a radar contact. Kalen was there in seconds, his face tight with familiar tension. Aurelia followed, her heart skipping a beat. A faint, irregular blip was flickering on the edge of the radar, roughly 5 miles to the northeast. It wasn't moving like a commercial vessel. It was drifting, caught in the current that swept along the edge of the continental shelf. Kalen brought the long-range optics online, the image stabilizing on the main screen. Aurelia gasped as the pixelated shape resolved into a boat. It was a white fishing vessel, perhaps 35 feet long. Its outriggers were snapped, trailing in the water like broken limbs, and the hull was stained with streaks of rust and salt. It looked like a ghost ship. "It's dead in the water," Kalen muttered, his fingers flying across the console to adjust the focus. No engine signature on the thermal. No smoke from the exhaust. "It's just drifting." He zoomed in further, the high-definition camera cutting through the sea haze. The deck was a mess of blue tarps, plastic jugs, and tangled fishing nets. Then, figures began to appear from under the tarps. A man stood at the railing, his movement slow and agonizingly weak. He held a piece of orange fabric, waving it with a rhythmic, desperate motion that broke Aurelia's heart. Behind him, a woman sat on a cooler, clutching two small shapes against her. Kalen's breath hitched. He stepped closer to the screen, his eyes widening as he recognized the lines of the boat and the silhouette of the man. "I know that boat," he whispered, his voice thick with a mix of recognition and dread. "That's the sea nymph. I used to see it in the harbor every morning." Aurelia watched as the man on the screen collapsed back into a seated position, his strength clearly spent. Kalen adjusted the optics one last time, freezing the frame on the family. "It's them," he said. "Mark and Juliana. And the kids. Colton and Kyra." Aurelia looked at the family on the screen. They were emaciated, their skin cracked and white with salt. They looked like they had been hollowed out by the sun and the sea. The fishing boat drifted slowly, caught in a swell that pushed it relentlessly toward the massive, pristine hull of their ship. The sanctuary they had built over the last 2 months was no longer private. The world had arrived at their doorstep in the form of 4 starving people, and the silence they had cultivated was gone forever. The boat bumped softly against the side of the ship, a dull thud that echoed through the hull like a gavel. Mark looked up, his sunken eyes meeting the camera lens of the ship's security system. He didn't shout. He didn't have the strength to scream. He just held up a hand, his fingers trembling, as Juliana pulled Colton and Kyra closer to her in the shadows of the tarp. They were here, and the 2 months of isolation had ended with the arrival of the very thing Kalen had tried to escape: other people.